but he's doing this on his own now. He's got his own company, Rocky Mountain Streams, and he's got much better technology and would like some donations. In the Rockies hat, Colorado Rockies, it's spring training time. Colorado Rockies hat dedicated, set aside for Trace Melton. For those of you that just like the fact that we're streaming, that's worth something to you to know that there's people watching in England, when somebody watching on a recorded basis, sometimes in Australia, soldiers in Iraq. If that has value to you, throw some bucks in there. If it has value to you because you might not be able to show up for a meeting, would like to reserve the right, or reserve the ability to see it from your home, throw a few bucks in the kitty. And if you have friends in Michigan or Paris who you'd like to turn on to the club, throw some money into the internet into this. So it's called streaming. It's the Colorado Rockies hat. Okay?
And they're recorded for later, too.
Yeah, and they're recorded for later, so you can watch them later. You don't have to watch them live.
You must tell I'm a bad candidate, because I forgot to ask you for money also. So
See? Yeah. He needs money, too. So Matt's got a table set up there. Go ahead and browse through that. And thanks for coming, Matt.
thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
You bet. So tonight's program, about a 20-minute talk, okay, on this paper. It's about a 14, 15-page paper. It's posted on the website. If you go to the PikesPeakEconomicsClub.com website, click on events or click on the calendar for today, it'll bring up today's event, and it tells you about the paper, and then there's a click to the actual downloadable document. Okay, so anybody wants to look at it, that would be fine. I have a disclaimer from the very front, because we made a mistake with respect to our our regulators, with one of our business entities. And Mary Carol Maxim, who's the first person listed here, is not Director of Marketing for Austrian Capital. She is a research assistant. Is that right? Analyst. She's a research analyst. Okay? Because SEC has got very strict definitions of that now. Okay? So you can't just say I'm Director of Marketing or whatever. All right. So that disclaimer has to be made. And Theron, I don't have a bio for you, okay, because you didn't give me one and I didn't ask you for one. But I'll tell you a little bit about Theron Walker. Father Theron Walker is going to be the presenter for this, both tonight and at the Mises Institute in Auburn. Theron has got a church up at Castle Rock. In my opinion, a little jewel of a church. A bigger jewel than it was before, because it's growing, I'm presuming. Okay, it's called Emmaus Anglican Church. And that church preaches the liberty gospel. You can go to that church and you can hear a sermon and you will think it's 1776. Because the American Revolution was not won on the battlefield. That was the result. The American Revolution was won in the churches and the kitchen tables and the taverns of America, when people got the idea that we should be free. And that idea comes from Judeo-Christian heritage and background, history of America. And so that's what the church kind of preaches. And it's a great church. It's too bad it's so far away. But Castle Rock, Emmaus Anglican Church. Father Theron Walker. Give him a big hand.
Well, I wasn't entirely sure that I was going to be comfortable here. This is the first time I've spoken to an audience like this, but since an offering has been taken, I'm good. Now, this paper that I'm presenting tonight really is the fruit of three people's work, of Dr. Prentice and Mary Carol Maxim. It's everything in the paper that is meet and right. That's their work, and then there's my part. So whatever's wrong, just blame me. But really, it's been a lot of fun to work with these two people. Collaborative projects are a really kind of interesting thing. Usually when I write a sermon, for instance, the biggest problem isn't, people say, oh, what are you going to say? The biggest issue is, what am I going to not say? There's so much to say. It's, cut it down, cut it down, cut it down. We'll bring three people together, and it's not just Mary Carol's ideas and Paul's ideas and Theron's ideas. It's multiplying it out. So to have the three of us working together, there's a lot of incredible, oh, wow, well, have you read? No, I never heard of that. Oh, well, have you read? No, I never heard of that. So you get this coming together, and there's a wonderful kind of cross-pollination that happens. So I hope you enjoy the sense in which this is really a cross-disciplinary paper. So, the basic question, does government crowd out private responsibility? And we analyze the question from the perspective of economics, philosophy, and theology. Well, behind this question, there is a more basic question. Who is responsible for an individual's life and well-being? Who is responsible?
Yourself.
Ooh, this is a good crowd. Can I get an amen? That's right. Yourself. Exactly. Who is responsible? And throughout history, the answer has been the individual is responsible. Now, there have been a few caveats, such as children, adults are responsible for children. The physically or mentally handicapped, or the mentally ill or senile. Others are profoundly responsible for them. But self-accountability, from this flows the very premise that man has a will to self-preservation. And therefore it stands to reason that he must both have the responsibility and the freedom necessary to survive. If a man expects another to be responsible for his life and well-being, what is he? If someone else is responsible, I expect someone else to be responsible for my life and my well-being. What am I now? I am a slave. Let my people go. Right? Well, the American experiment stems from the fundamental belief that individuals are capable of self-government. And we don't need neither rulers nor masters. We don't need them. And indeed, these principles were the cohesive glue of American culture throughout the early 20th century, up until just prior to World War I. Up until just prior to World War I, this is great Paul Prentice stuff right here. Total government in the United States, federal, state, and local, combined to commandeer 5 to 10% of the economy. 5 to 10% of all government. Now that left 90 to 95% of the economy to the voluntary sector. So people were at liberty to pursue their individual interests and property pursuant to a moral code without significant government intrusion. Well, this view of the proper relationship between the individual and the government began to change with the advent and the sad eventual triumph of the progressive era and the social gospel. And gradually these unique founding ideas were replaced. They were replaced with what Calvin Coolidge called regression. Regression back to earlier ideas that men were not capable of self-government, that we had to have masters, that we had to be ruled. And it is a historical irony that this regression would be called progress. As the administrative state espoused by Frank Goodenow and Woodrow Wilson began to take over our private, voluntary human action, the essential character of the American people began to change. A full century, and that's what we've had now, a full century of this political system has replaced a culture of individual responsibility with a culture of personal entitlement. Slavery. Well, how did we get here? How did we get from a time where the major political and social debates are now, the big debates now are over the size of the welfare state, not whether we should have one or not. The debates are now, how enslaved can we be? Right? Well, how did we shift from the belief that an individual's survival and well-being was first and foremost his own responsibility, and secondarily that of his family and immediate community, to that of the government? Did the civic and religious associations of the United States' early history break down and stop providing for the needy, or were they crowded out by government? Well, they were crowded out. They were crowded out. The development of government social programs was pretty slow until the massive upheavals brought about by the Great Depression. Fixed by the New Deal, right? That's what I was always told. Well, instead of the concern that government involvement would erode private charity, as was the case well into the 1800s, the concern shifted to be that private charities would somehow relieve government of its proper duties. I mean, that's kind of where it's at now. Well, here's some evidence. Evidence from the 1930s shows that government programs, regulations, and taxation crowded out personal responsibility. Here's some stuff from Arthur C. Brooks, and this is on the effect on the role of churches. So here's what Brooks says. In a recent study, economists found evidence that Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal programs sharply reduced churches' charitable giving to the poor. The researchers noticed a 30% drop in church-based charity from 1933 through 1939 as federal spending to aid the needy went from 0 to more than 4% of GDP. The researchers concluded that government funds were directly responsible for nearly all the drop in private church charity. Oh, if the government doesn't do it, nobody will do it. If we don't force people to do it, it won't happen. Well, as government expenditures rose in the mid-30s, private charity dropped, despite charitable giving having risen fivefold and more in the early 1930s. So private charity was actually rising. And then in comes the New Deal. And it pushes it back. Well, government research is validated by research on a large New York City charity, the New York Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor. It reported a significant drop in material relief as the New Deal programs were instituted. And you can see the tables illustrating these things if you look at our paper that's available on the website. On top of this, there's skyrocketing tax rates on the wealthy. So the wealthy, they feel less charitable and they have less disposable income to give. And furthermore, charities themselves reported making shifts in their priorities away from relief and into health services and counseling. Well, Mary Carroll has found this comprehensive 1984 study by Russell Roberts, and it examines the receipt of individual, corporate, and foundation donations in the years 1955 to 1981. So we're getting into Great Society time, okay? Well, when these programs are instituted, guess what? Charitable giving drops. It drops significantly. In inflation-adjusted dollars, donations to social services stayed essentially flat between 1955 and 1981, with significant growth in all other categories. So I kind of stopped giving to help the needy, and I give to the symphony. Well, furthermore, the growth of charitable giving declined precipitously from 1970 to 1975 as the Great Society programs grew expansively. You get to see the picture, I think. Well, further indication of crowding out is seen as individual giving as a proportion of personal income dropped 13% between 1960 and 1976. 13%. And this is despite rising prosperity. And the proportion of philanthropic giving devoted to social welfare declined from 15% to 6%. And by the mid-70s, governments spend about 10 times as much on social services as nonprofit agencies. And nonprofit agencies themselves received 1/2 of their revenue from the government. Now, contrast this with the end of the 19th century, when nearly all poor relief was provided for through private charity. But numbers don't tell the complete story. Individual attitudes towards personal responsibility help us understand the crowding out effect. So here is something, this is from Brooks. In 1996, a large sample of Americans were asked to respond to this statement, quote, "The government has a responsibility to reduce income inequality." Here's your question. 43% of respondents disagreed with this statement. 33% agreed. Now here it comes. This is like the preaching moment, okay? When it came to charity, these two groups were radically different. Not only were those who disagreed significantly more likely to give money to charity than those who agreed, they also gave away, on average, 4 times as much money per year. So, with tragic irony, when someone believes it's the government's responsibility to spread the wealth around, his personal giving of money and time decreases. In 2002, quote, "People who stated that they thought the government was spending too little money on welfare were less likely than those saying the government is spending too much money on welfare to give food or money to a homeless person." So all those, cold-hearted conservatives, it turns out, are personally more generous. Proponents of sharing the wealth through the government are less likely to volunteer their time or even give blood than people who favor voluntary giving. As Brooks writes, this is nothing more than substituting political opinions for private donations. And the opinions may or may not be sound, but the giving is conspicuously absent. Well, now I'm going to have a little bit of fun. And I want to bring back to mind the presidential debate from 2004 between George W. Bush and John Kerry. And maybe you're going to remember this little scene I'm going to bring to mind. And it's, the internet's an amazing thing. I could just go online and find this, and here's a transcript. So, here we go. Bob Schieffer. I'd like to ask you, what part does your faith play on your policy decisions? Bush. First, my faith plays a big part in my life, right? But when I make decisions, said Bush, I won't do a whole, West Texas thing. I stand on principle, and the principles are derived from who I am. I believe we ought to love our neighbor like we love ourselves, as manifested in public policy through my faith-based initiative, where we've unleashed the armies of compassion to help heal people who hurt. I believe that God wants everybody to be free. Okay? Schieffer. Senator Kerry? Well, I respect everything that the president has said, and I certainly respect his faith. I think it's important and I share it. I think he just said that freedom is a gift from the Almighty. I was taught, and I went to church school, and I was taught that the 2 greatest commandments are love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body, and your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. And frankly, I think we have a lot more loving of our neighbor to do in this country and on this planet. Okay. And the president and I have a difference of opinion about how we live out our sense of faith. I talked about it earlier when I talked about the works and faith without works being dead. Maybe you know that passage from James. So in Senator Kerry's logic, faith tells us to love our neighbors, and faith without works is dead. Therefore, we need to fight for justice. Okay? Well, I wish Schieffer had asked each man how much they give out of their own pockets or to what. Now, fortunately for us, these things are public records, and people have done the digging to find some of this stuff out. So these are numbers reported from Peter Schweitzer's book, Makers and Takers, and I hope some of you have read that book. It's really a remarkable book, Makers and Takers. Here's what he writes. In 1995, Kerry reported a taxable income of $126,179, but gave nothing to charity. In 1994, Kerry did muster $2,039 in charitable contributions, still well below the national average. In 1993, he gave $175 to the needy. By contrast, Bush believed he was responsible personally to give. In 92, Bush reported an income of $212,313 and contributions of $31,914, better than a tithe. In 93, Bush reported income of $610,772 and contributions of $31,292, less than a tithe. Look out, George, I'm coming for you. Well, Schweitzer uses this data along with that of an incredible list of other people who fall in these kind of positions. And what you see in the pattern again and again and again is basically those who believe it's government's job to care for the poor do not believe individuals should be compassionate. They believe society should be compassionate with OPM, other people's money. And I'm running out of time. Well, so all these scriptures get thrown around, and, my faith without works is dead, blah, blah, blah. And you get in this fog of the debates and the arguments, and no, he's rich, what does he know? On and on and on. And we see how these things get incredibly foggy. And we see how religious language can be used without asking real questions about the relationship of the individual to the state, public versus private, or coercion versus voluntary action. So we want to define three important terms that we got that are right there in our title: government, private, and responsibility. And we're going to use Hayek's definition that government is the coercive sphere of human action, and private is the voluntary sphere. So, by government, we mean all that's coercive: law, regulation, administrative rules, taxation. If you don't do it, the sheriff is coming to your house. Okay? And we define responsibility in the classical liberal tradition, implying self-governance, compassion for others, adherence to a moral code of behavior. And private morality is based on the ethics of reciprocity, the golden rule: do to others as you would have them do to you. So the question again is, was this transition that we've looked at, this 20th century transitions, yes, was this transition in culture coincidental with increasing government, or did increasing government cause the transition? So here is where we get into Austrian economic theory. And economics is simply the study of how people take conscious action to allocate their scarce resources to meet their unscarce wants and needs. Thanks, Paul. Now, people respond to individually perceived subjective costs and benefits at the margin. And in order to examine the question, we have to examine incentives. That's something Clark Maxim taught me. Always look at the incentives. Follow the incentives. So we have to look at the incentives involved in government regulation compared with those involved in private activity, which Mises called an investigation into human action. So, friends, are there market incentives to do the right thing? Are there market incentives to do the right thing? Now, here comes a quote from an investment manager. He wrote, "When we have regulators, we outsource our thinking." An Austrian economist believed that profit-oriented incentives based on human nature and human action are sufficient to ensure moral behavior over time. And we're going to try to prove this. Immoral businesses are weeded out by the marketplace ecosystem. Just Darwinian economic survival requires you to be a moral actor in business. Immoral businesses can survive only one way, over time, by using the coercive power of the government. We got a law passed, so you have to buy my Volt. Right? That's the only way an immoral business can survive. By crony capitalism. And since customers willingly engage in voluntary exchange, and since private businesses are forbidden from using force to secure their customer base, only the guns of government can make people buy what they don't want from people with whom they don't want to do business. Well, there's a very interesting study, results of a number of studies, from a man named David Wessel. And these are some economic experiments in which market participants routinely acted more generously than mainstream economists predicted. And not only were the results of these experiments counterintuitive to mainstream economists, they were consistent across cultures and societies. So he concludes, the more involved people are in market activities, such as working for wages or buying and selling goods to others, the more generous they are. You know, what's the number one rule in business? Service. Service, service, service. Service. You know, if you come into my place of business and I'm really going to manipulate you and screw you over, you'll come once, right? How do repeat customers come? Service. Who are the happiest customers? The ones that don't have buyer's remorse. The ones where you really take the time and the effort to find out what they want. So you leave the negotiation with win-win. Service. Well, Samuel Bowles, an experimental economist at the University of Massachusetts and a research professor in the Behavioral Sciences program at the Santa Fe Institute, surveyed 50 experimental studies regarding incentives and social preference. He concluded that markets teach us to behave decently to strangers because of the necessity to engage in mutually beneficial activity, and that government interference can have a perverse effect on individual morality. Be nice to the customers. Well, I don't know who that is. I'm not related to them. I didn't go to school with them. Do you want to make a sale or not? Be good to the customers. So here's a quote from Samuel Bowles. Explicit economic incentives designed to increase contributions to public goods and to promote other pro-social behaviors sometimes are counterproductive or less effective than would be predicted among entirely self-interested individuals. And this may occur when incentives adversely affect individuals' altruism, ethical norms, intrinsic motives to serve the public, and other social preferences. In the 50 experimental studies that we survey, these effects are common. Now, from Heinrich and others, he published a thorough review of literature on this subject. And the authors find that experiments done in diverse populations show that an individual's fairness in interactions with others is positively predicted by market integration. So listen to what Heinrich writes. Large-scale human societies require trust and fairness among strangers to sustain mutually beneficial transactions. And the rise of such evolutionary novel societies may have required the co-emergence of norms and informal institutions that harness our evolved psychology to facilitate exchange among non-repeat interactants. You know, I'm selling, you're buying. Treat each other with decency, with respect, with honesty. Do to me as I would have you, you know what I mean, the golden rule. Do that thing and it's going to work. It's going to work. And it does work. Well, how am I doing? I'm really close to out of time, aren't I? Well, if human nature drives us toward voluntary exchange and personal responsibility, does government regulation enhance or detract from moral behavior? If it enhances personal responsibility, we can say it crowds in. You know, government gets closer and it makes me be more moral. However, if government detracts from personal responsibility, we can say that it crowds out. So more government regulation and control leads to what? Less private responsibility. Human action changes from being based on questions such as, is it right? To, is it legal? Well, in the sphere of personal behavior and values, government creates moral hazards. So that everything from childbearing to illicit drug use to house location becomes based on an individual's being able to access the benefits while being able to offload the costs to society. And human action, based on cost and benefits at the margin, becomes skewed toward more risky behaviors since costs are externalized while benefits are internalized. Housing bubble, right? Mises' insight into economic calculation no longer works to allow Adam Smith's invisible hand to guide toward greater value and prosperity. Well, I'm going to just kind of move forward a little bit and skip to the end. Well, throughout this paper, we have examined a shift in our civilization, especially in America. We've looked at a shift in where human responsibility lies. And we've seen these shifts in philosophy, and we've seen a shift in the coercive power of government. We've seen people assume that if you love your neighbor, that means you have to use the coercive power of the state to look out for your neighbor. And the reality is, the more you turn to coercion, even to do something as wonderful as help somebody, you mess it up. You mess it up for the would-be givers. And what do we see? We see that people who think it's government's job to care, they stop caring. And we know that as dependency is built, it messes up people who are dependent. We've seen a culture that become increasingly passive and irresponsible. And the more we're regulated, the less we feel to the need to regulate ourselves. the more we are regulated, the less we feel the need to regulate ourselves. The more we are regulated, the less we feel the need to even reach out to others. Reciprocal liberty falls to envy, coveting, control. No wonder public and private debt is at astronomical levels. Throughout the study, we've seen Christian language, being the predominant faith tradition in America, used, misused. We've seen it horribly misused. If you love your neighbor, you're going to use government to help him. Wow. We were created, and I believe this is true biblical language, we were created not to be coerced and not to coerce others. We were created not to be our brother's keeper, but to practice reciprocal liberty. I'm not my brother's keeper. I'm my brother's neighbor, but not his keeper. And he's not my keeper either. Thank you. Close it out with another quote from Arthur Brooks. In a recent eulogy to James Q. Wilson, quote, Wilson understood that the moral sense is what statist regimes crowd out with technocratic socialism, and why they ultimately deliver unhappiness. The moral sense is the reason freedom and individual responsibility give us the best chance at a meaningful life. Thank you. Well, Paul,
Thank you, Theron.
you give me a lectern and it turns into a pulpit, and here we are. We're kind of over.
That's well done. We have to find a way to cut this in
Good.
half
Holy
Friday.
cannoli!
by
Yep.
Friday, so we're on a panel. Thank you all for listening. Mary Carol, why don't you stand up? She did a lot of the writing and research for this. Mary Carol Maxim, give her hand. Outstanding. And any questions from the audience? We have a few minutes. Anybody would like to ask anything or discuss something? We can take a few questions. And Trace, if anybody is, do we have chat on the internet, or is it just people watching?
Yeah, the Royal Paul channel's full of Super Tuesday stuff, but the Mises channel was freeze for Austrian economics. They loved you.
Naturally. Okay.
I can live with that. Yeah.
All right. Any questions? Come on up here or raise your hand. Yes.
The question is more of a comment. I was involved in service clubs. I was in Kiwanis for many, many years, and all those service clubs have declined precipitously over the years. Lions, Rotary, I don't know about Rotary. I'll speak for Lions and Kiwanis because I had most involved with them. And they always wondered why, and there was always a suspicion that it was greater involvement of the government in our everyday charitable evolutions that really kind of crowded us out. And I just say, I think that supports your paper.
And just think about how a community itself is changed when you outsource community service from volunteers, people who come together across faith traditions, or even without faith, and you bring people together who want to do something good for other people, and but now it just, it's lost in taxes. Incredible. Yes.
So I'm thinking about Alexis de Tocqueville and how he had made several warnings about, our country was founded on this voluntary organization that was not existent in Europe. And he was very impressed with that, but it's kind of sad. I'd hate to see him back here now to see what had happened.
Unfortunately, we have some great Tocqueville stuff in the paper.
You
You're
can
absolutely right. You know,
You can download the whole paper at pikespeakeconomicsclub.com. Click on today's event. It takes you to today's event page. Scroll down and you'll see a click to continue reading. You can download the entire PDF of the paper. So one more, and then you can schmooze around a bit, and we have to be out of here about 8:30 and let the staff clean up. But any more questions? We have two more then, maybe three. Okay, I know, one here. Okay.
I'm not so much a question again, but a comment, but I thought the most powerful line you said tonight, out of many powerful lines, was substituting what is legal for what is right.
And that's next year's paper.
Because I just thought, mortgage default, MF Global, the banking system, it just goes on and on, substituting what's legal for what's right.
Okay, thank you. I think everybody's got some anecdotal evidence from their own life that this rings true, because you have observed American society over the last 30 or 40 years, and you've seen the change, and you've been involved in the change. And you've all experienced this at a very personal level, probably. There was a question at the back, and then we'll come to Tom.
I had a question a little bit more broadly. Why do you think that so many of your religious counterparts maybe don't fall on this type of a side? Why? It seems very common sense to me as a Christian that God would be in favor of individual liberty and to choose on your own. But why do so many? I would love to hear your insight on why your counterparts in a religious maybe don't fall themselves in that way.
so I've been asked to repeat the question, so it'll go through the microphone thing. The question is, why is it that so many people in my profession and in the Christian faith believe that to love your neighbor means using the coercive power of the state? Why? Did I get that right? And I want to refer you again to the wonderful section of our paper written by Mary Carol Maxim, where Mary Carol really spends a good chunk of time going through the progressive era and the development of the social gospel. And that whole social gospel concept, and one of the key guys in that is a guy named Walter Rauschenbusch, and they just had this idea that we have to fix society, and the way to fix society, to bring the kingdom of God here so people would do things according to Jesus' ways, we just have to use coercion to do that. But they didn't even really think of it as coercion. Like if you were to push them and say, brother, you're forcing people to do that. Oh, well, no. We're all part of the government, and we're just voting it in, so it's not really coercion. But they don't really think about it. I mean, I think that's a lot of the heart of the thing. They just don't really think, oh my gosh, if I'm using the government to do this, I'm forcing people. So one of the things I try to do is I try to say, as a Christian, I believe it's immoral to use coercion to get other people to believe what I believe. Persuasion, I'm all for persuasion, right? But not coercion. So if that's what you believe about religion, why don't you believe that about charity? Oh, well, I never thought of it that way. So Paul's kind of moderating.
Yeah, we have one more over here.
With all this talk about coercion, I'm curious where and how we draw the line between coercion and majority rule.
So were the founders.
Right, so the question is, how do we draw the line between coercion and majority rule? And I think that's a good reason why we are a republic and why we believe that there are immutable laws that are, we don't believe in an open constitution, do we? Because we believe that there is such a thing as truth, that we don't want to turn everything over to the mob.
I'll give you a couple quotes on that.
Good.
It's from Walter Williams, an Austrian trained economist. Okay, Walter Williams said something like this. He said, the Bible says thou shalt not steal. It doesn't say thou shalt not steal unless you have a 51% vote of Congress. Okay. And then another one, from our founding era, from Ben Franklin, okay, when they were discussing this, they were discussing exactly this. Democracy, republic, representative democracy, mob rule, individual rights, minority rights. How do we protect all this in the context of governance? Okay, so quote Ben Franklin. I think this is not a paraphrase. This is as close to a quote as I can come. Democracy has to be more than two wolves and a sheep voting on lunch.
There's another app to that. I forgot what it is, but a well-armed
Liberty is a well-armed sheep.
Liberty is a well-armed sheep.
Great question, Tim. I think we're going to call this to an end, unless there's maybe one more. We have time for one more. Yes.
Just a little bit of a comment, and we're talking a little bit sidebar about the experience of Europe and the erosion of the role of the churches in Europe. They really have been kind of secularized and institutionalized and taken under the developing arms of the state. And you see that really where faith and religion has completely fallen off because of that. I wonder if you might address that or talk about that a little bit, because I think it's very instructive.
Well, I'm really glad you asked.
Page 3.
The question is, why has Europe become so secularized? And what is going on in Europe where the churches are really taken over by the state? And that is actually part of the paper. And so once again, I do refer you to the paper. But I will say this. There is a thing in sociology that they call the secularization thesis. And the secularization thesis is that as society becomes more modern, it becomes increasingly secular, because that is the European experience. Well, the exception is America. So European sociologists and then American sociologists, what do you do to make sense out of the American exception? And their answer is, well, Americans must just be stupid. Obviously. Because it doesn't fit their what? Their theory. Because they always start with theory, right? And then, mash us into it rather than starting with reality. Okay, so, well, here's a counter thesis. I'll give you a couple for examples. In modern Germany, on your income taxes, so you got your income, 8% of your income goes to support the German churches. But hardly anybody goes to church. It's the same thing throughout Europe. So the thesis is, when you outsource the responsibility of your religion to the state, when it's all handled through coercion, you don't care. It loses its value to you. And as clergy, if you're getting paid through taxes, how hard are you going to work?
Who's your allegiance to?
That's right. And by the way, I just finished reading the wonderful biography about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and by Metaxas, I think that's the name. When you read that story, one of the major challenges for all those wonderful Lutheran pastors was they were paid by the state. So if they took a stand, they could lose everything. Everything.
As opposed to American churches where you might lose your 501c3. All right, just one more. Okay, so let's have Tom.
Got to follow up on what you just said, because as a small business person, I've been asked this by some of my employees. And a few years ago, I went out and did an analysis. You mentioned tithing. In my church, we talk about, yes, you tithe, 10%. Tithe doesn't, you don't tithe 2%. Tithe means 10%. And you're also supposed to volunteer time. So one of my employees came to me and said, but I'm already tithing. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, in my taxes, I pay Social Security. Social Security is not my retirement. Social Security is me giving money to the government so that they can go take care of the elderly. The employer's share of the Social Security is a tithe that I'm paying. Because if you weren't paying that on my behalf, I'd be getting that money, theoretically. Look at the federal government and how much I pay in federal income tax and what percentage of the federal government goes to transfer payments to take care of supposedly the needy. And then let's look at state income tax. What percentage of my taxes go for Medicaid and so on. And went out and did an analysis, and the average person making between $40,000 and $45,000 a year is already tithing about 14% before they get their first dollar in take-home pay. So the question becomes, it's not a matter of are the churches now being supported by this 8% tax as in Germany, but the work that the churches used to perform is now being funded completely by the tithing, but we're giving the tithe to the government instead of to the church.
A little twist in this is William Penn. You know, you get the whole this whole tradition of reciprocal liberty, and it started for William Penn because there he was, this nobleman in England, and he became a convinced Quaker. Well, as a good Englishman, in England, the Church of England, the Anglicans, of which I am a part, had a right to tithe. And it had a right to use, like the local sheriff or bailiff, to go and get a tithe from him. Well, one of the things that the Quakers were saying was, this shouldn't be coerced. This is totally related to religious liberty. You shouldn't be coercing my support of the local church. And, out of this springs Pennsylvania. Out of this springs the Liberty Bell. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. It's pretty incredible stuff. But the only thing I would sort of counter to that, and that whole, I'm already paying it, is, and there's, Arthur Brooks does great stuff with this, is being a generous person voluntarily changes you. It changes you in a way that that paying taxes will never change you.
Okay. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming. And let's give Father Theron one more big hand. And next month, on the first Tuesday of the month, we're going to have Ann Barnhart come here and speak. And maybe some of you may have heard of Ann Barnhart. She's a commodities trader over for a little bit on the Western Slope. And she pulled a very public Atlas Shrugged. She pulled a John Galt several months ago, with just the corruption of the financial system was just too much for her, and she said, I'm done. So she shut down her business and walked. So she's going to talk about her background, her experience in working in the futures market, just trying to have farmers and ranchers manage the price risk of their commodities, and what that did to her and her business. So that'll be the first Tuesday of April. Thank you all for coming. Help yourself to some snacks on the way out. Don't forget the kiddie pool at the back. And don't forget money to trace.
I have flyers and envelopes.
Oh, don't forget. Don't forget. If you like what Tom Arnold has to say, stop and listen. We'll do that again.